She believed she didn't deserve forgiveness, but a cat showed her otherwise. The Charleston rain fell in relentless sheets that October morning, drumming against the Victorian windows like impatient fingers. Marjorie Hale stood in her darkened hallway, watching water cascade down glass panes that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The sound should have been comforting. She'd always loved storms as a child, but now it only amplified the hollow echo of her footsteps on the hardwood floors. At 52, Marjorie had become a ghost in her own home. The once grand house on Rutledge Avenue, with its wraparound porches and intricate gingerbread trim, had fallen into the same state of neglect as its owner. Paint peeled from the shutters like old scabs. The garden had surrendered to weeds, and inside dust motes danced in the few slivers of light that managed to penetrate the heavy curtains she kept perpetually drawn. The isolation had been her choice, though choice felt like too generous a word. 6 months ago, her pride had cost her everything that mattered. The family law practice she'd built over 2 decades had crumbled when she'd made a series of devastating professional decisions, each one compounding the last. Her refusal to admit mistakes, to ask for help, or to show vulnerability had driven away her business partner, her clients, and finally, her own sister, Emma. The last conversation with Emma still played on endless repeat in her mind. "You're so wrapped up in being perfect that you've forgotten how to be human, Marjorie. When you're ready to be real with me, call. But I'm done pretending this is okay." That had been 4 months ago. The phone hadn't rung since. Marjorie pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and shuffled toward the kitchen, her slippers whispering across the floor. The routine had become sacred. Coffee from yesterday's pot, reheated in the microwave because the effort of making fresh seemed insurmountable. She'd eat yesterday's takeout containers, if she ate at all, and spend the day moving from room to room like a ship without anchor. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through the morning quiet, making her freeze mid-step. No one came to visit anymore. She crept to the front window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A delivery truck was pulling away, leaving behind a package on her covered porch. Medical supplies she'd ordered online. Another small concession to the fact that she had to keep existing, even if living felt impossible. The rain had intensified when she finally worked up the courage to open the front door. The package sat there, slightly damp despite the porch roof, and she bent to retrieve it quickly. But as she straightened, something grey and soaked darted between her legs. What the? A cat. A grey tabby with white markings on its chest and paws, absolutely drenched from the storm. It had shot past her with surprising agility for something so waterlogged, and now it sat in her foyer, amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her take a step back. "Oh no," she said aloud, her voice rusty from disuse. "No, no, no, you can't be here." The cat tilted its head, studying her with what seemed like curious concern. It wasn't particularly large, maybe 8 or 9 pounds, but there was something substantial about its presence, something that filled the space in a way Marjorie herself hadn't in months. Water dripped from its fur onto the hardwood, creating small puddles that caught what little light filtered through the windows. "Shoo," she said weakly, making a half-hearted gesture toward the open door. "Go on, get out." Instead of fleeing, the cat began to groom itself with methodical precision, starting with one white paw. The sound of its rough tongue against wet fur was oddly soothing, a living rhythm in the tomb-quiet house. When it finished with the paw, it looked up at her again, those amber eyes unwavering. Marjorie found herself frozen in a staring contest with a stray cat. The absurdity of the situation might have made her laugh if she remembered how. Outside, thunder rumbled closer, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. She couldn't exactly throw the creature back into the storm, could she? "Fine," she muttered, closing the door with more force than necessary. "But just until the rain stops. Then you're gone." The cat stood and began exploring, moving through her living room with the confidence of someone conducting an inspection. It sniffed the base of the cold fireplace, investigated the stack of unopened mail on the coffee table, and finally settled on the Persian rug in front of the hearth, looking perfectly at home. As Marjorie watched this uninvited guest claim her space, something stirred in her chest, a feeling she couldn't immediately identify because it had been absent for so long. Later, she would recognize it as curiosity. The cat's movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if it had somewhere important to be and had chosen her living room as that destination. "What are you doing?" she asked, surprised by the sound of her own voice in conversation. even if her conversational partner couldn't answer back. The cat looked at her again, then stretched out fully on the rug, revealing the lean muscle beneath its damp fur. There was something chess-like about the way it had positioned itself, she thought. Strategic, commanding the room from the center, like a rook piece, holding its ground and surveying the board. "Rook," she said suddenly, the name escaping before she could stop it. The cat's ears perked forward at the sound. "That's what you look like, a rook." It was the first time in months she'd named anything, the first time she'd made any kind of creative decision that wasn't purely functional. The simple act felt monumental in its ordinariness. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Rook seemed to approve of the name, or at least didn't object. She was somehow certain it was a he, closed his eyes and began to purr, a sound like a tiny engine warming up. The vibration seemed to fill the room, competing with the rain for acoustic dominance. Marjorie retreated to the kitchen, ostensibly to finish making her coffee, but really to process what had just happened. In the span of 10 minutes, her carefully maintained isolation had been breached by a soggy stranger who now lay purring on her most expensive rug. She should feel invaded, violated. Her sanctuary had been compromised. Instead, as she listened to that steady purring from the next room, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She wasn't entirely alone. When she returned to the living room with her reheated coffee, Rook had moved to the window seat, his front paws pressed against the glass as he watched the storm. From this new vantage point, he seemed to be surveying the street, keeping watch. The sight stirred another long-dormant emotion, the desire to see what he was seeing. Almost without thinking, she moved to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain just enough to peer out. The neighborhood looked different through rain-washed glass, softer somehow. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was struggling with her garbage cans, and Mr. Chen was hurrying his dog through a quick walk, both of them hunched against the weather. Normal people living normal lives, continuing to exist in the world she'd withdrawn from. Rook chirped softly, a sound somewhere between a meow and a trill, and she realized he was responding to the sight of other living creatures. When was the last time she'd acknowledged her neighbors? When had she stopped seeing them as fellow travelers instead of reminders of her own failure to maintain appearances? The cat jumped down from the window seat and padded toward the kitchen, stopping to look back at her expectantly. "What?" she asked, following him. "What do you want?" He sat beside the empty food bowl she kept for the occasional raccoon visitor, a habit from before her world collapsed, when she'd still felt connected to the simple kindness of feeding hungry creatures. Rook looked pointedly at the bowls, then up at her. "Oh," she said, understanding dawning. "You're hungry." The realization brought with it a cascade of practical concerns. She had no cat food. The leftover Chinese takeout in her refrigerator was probably too spicy for a cat. When had she last been to the grocery store? Really been, not just ordered delivery or relied on whatever she could find in her increasingly bare pantry. As if reading her thoughts, Rook meowed once, clearly and directly. It wasn't a demanding sound, but it wasn't a request either. It was a statement: "I am here, I am hungry, and you are the human responsible for doing something about it." Standing in her kitchen, looking down at this unexpected guest who had somehow made her space feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home, Marjorie felt the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself. It was tiny, barely perceptible, but it was there. Tomorrow, she realized, she would have to leave the house. She would have to buy cat food. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as Rook wound around her ankles with surprising gentleness, she felt something that might have been relief. She had a reason to venture back into the world, even if it was just to feed a stray cat who had invited himself in from the storm. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, for the first time in months, Marjorie wasn't entirely alone with her ghosts. The grocery store's fluorescent lights felt harsh after months of living in perpetual twilight. Marjorie stood just inside the automatic doors of the Harris Teeter on King Street, clutching a small piece of paper with "cat food" written in her shaky handwriting. The familiar anxiety rose in her chest, the fear that everyone was watching, judging, recognizing her as the woman whose life had spectacularly imploded in full view of Charleston's legal community. But Rook had been insistent that morning, sitting by his empty bowl with the patient determination of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen. When she'd tried to offer him leftover rotisserie chicken, he'd sniffed it politely and walked away, returning to sit by the bowl. The message was clear: proper food, proper care, or nothing at all. The pet food aisle overwhelmed her with choices: dry, wet, grain-free, organic, for kittens, for seniors, for indoor cats, for outdoor adventurers. She stood frozen, remembering when even simple decisions came easily to her. Before, she would have researched, compared reviews, made the optimal choice with confidence. Now, she stared at rows of colorful packaging like they contained state secrets. First cat? Marjorie turned to find an elderly woman with kind eyes and a shopping cart filled with various pet supplies. Her voice was gentle, without the pity Marjorie had grown to expect from the few people who still recognized her. Yes. Well, no, it's not really my cat. The words tumbled out awkwardly. He just appeared. The woman smiled. They have a way of doing that. Found my Duchess under my car during Hurricane Hugo. 23 years later, she was still choosing where I sat in my own living room. She reached for a bag of dry food with a simple label. This one's good for strays, easy on their stomachs, all the nutrition they need, and it doesn't break the bank. Thank you, Marjorie whispered, accepting the bag like a gift. What's his name? Rook? Like the chess piece? That's perfect. Cats are strategic creatures. He probably chose you very carefully. The woman's eyes twinkled. I'm Dorothy, by the way. Dorothy Mills. Marjorie Hale. Dorothy's expression didn't change, though Marjorie was certain she'd heard the name. In a city like Charleston, legal scandals traveled fast and stayed fresh in memory, but Dorothy just smiled warmly. Well, Marjorie, welcome to cat parenthood. Fair warning, it changes everything. Walking home with the cat food felt like carrying evidence of a crime. She'd also bought wet food, treats, and, in a moment of what felt like reckless abandon, a small toy mouse with a bell inside. Each purchase had been a tiny victory over the paralysis that had defined her recent existence. Rook was waiting in the front window when she returned, his grey form silhouetted against the glass like a sentry. The sight of him stopped her cold on the front walkway. Someone was waiting for her. Someone was glad she was home. I brought food, she announced as she entered, holding up the shopping bag like a peace offering. Rook's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He wound around her legs, purring loudly, then led her directly to the kitchen with the efficiency of an experienced tour guide. As she opened the can of wet food, the rich smell of chicken and gravy filled the air, and Rook's purring intensified to the point where it seemed to vibrate through the floor. She set the bowl down and watched him eat with focused intensity. Everything about the way he approached food spoke of recent hardship. He ate quickly but not frantically, like someone who'd learned not to take meals for granted, but wasn't starving. Between bites, he looked up at her with what seemed like gratitude. Where did you come from? She asked aloud, then felt foolish for talking to a cat. But Rook paused his eating to chirp at her, as if acknowledging the question deserved an answer he couldn't provide. Over the following days, Rook began to reveal his personality in layers. He was particular about routine, wanting breakfast at exactly 7:30, dinner at 5, and a small evening snack before bed. He had strong opinions about sleeping arrangements, claiming the antique armchair in the living room as his throne, and making it clear that her bedroom was off-limits, unless specifically invited. Most remarkably, he seemed determined to bring light back into the house. Every morning Marjorie would wake to find him sitting at different windows, staring pointedly at the closed curtains until she opened them. It started with just one window, then two, then half the living room. Each day, more sunlight crept into spaces that had been shrouded in darkness for months. "You're very bossy," she told him one morning as she opened the kitchen curtains at his silent insistence. He responded with a satisfied chirp and immediately claimed the sunny patch that appeared on the floor. The changes were subtle but undeniable. With light came the urge to clean the windows. With clean windows came the realization that the view was actually beautiful. Her garden, while overgrown, was full of late-blooming roses and autumn jasmine. With that realization came the first stirring of something that might have been interest in the world beyond her front door. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Rook began limping. The limp was slight, favoring his right front paw, but unmistakable. Marjorie knelt beside his food bowl, gently extending her hand toward his paw. "Let me see," she said softly. To her surprise, Rook allowed the examination, even extending his paw slightly to help. There, between his toes, she found a small splinter of wood, probably picked up during his explorations of her neglected back porch. The splinter was tiny, easily removed with tweezers, but the sight of it lodged in his pink paw pad made something clench in her chest. This creature, who had somehow made himself essential to her daily routine, was hurt, and it was probably her fault. If she'd maintained her property better, if she'd fixed the loose boards on the porch, if she'd been the kind of person who took care of things, instead of letting them fall apart. "I'm sorry," she whispered, carefully pulling out the splinter. Rook remained perfectly still, trusting her completely. "I'm sorry I let everything get so broken." After cleaning the small wound with hydrogen peroxide, she called the veterinary clinic she'd found online. Charleston Animal Care was only 6 blocks away, a small practice in a converted Victorian house not unlike her own. "Can you see a cat today?" she asked when the receptionist answered. "He has a small cut on his paw, and I want to make sure it doesn't get infected." "Of course. Can you bring him in at 2 o'clock? The words came out before she could stop them. "Yes, I'll be there." It wasn't until after she hung up that the full weight of what she'd agreed to hit her. She would have to leave the house, carry a cat in public, interact with strangers, answer questions about how long she'd had him, where she lived, what her name was. The familiar panic began to rise, but then Rook jumped into her lap, settling there with his particular brand of casual confidence. "I guess we're doing this," she told him, scratching behind his ears. His purring seemed to vibrate directly into her chest, steadying her heart rate. "You're going to have to help me, okay? I'm not very good at the outside world anymore." The cat carrier she'd impulsively bought at the grocery store sat unopened in the hall closet. As she assembled it that afternoon, Rook watched with interest but no apparent concern. When she opened the door and gestured inside, he walked in and sat down, looking at her expectantly. "Show off," she muttered, but she was grateful for his cooperation. The walk to the vet clinic took 12 minutes. She knew because she'd timed it obsessively on her phone. Rook rode quietly in the carrier, occasionally chirping at interesting sounds or sights. His calm presence made her own anxiety manageable, almost like having a therapy animal she hadn't realized she needed. The clinic's waiting room was painted in soothing blues and greens, with morning sunlight streaming through large windows. Several other pet owners sat with carriers and leashes, the quiet conversations and soft animal sounds creating an atmosphere of gentle purpose. Marjorie chose a seat near the window, setting Rook's carrier on the chair beside her. "Marjorie Hale?" She looked up to see a woman about her own age approaching with a clipboard and a warm smile. The woman was tall and athletic, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing scrubs covered in tiny paw prints. "I'm Dr. Clara Wren, and this must be Rook." Something about the name rang a bell, but Marjorie couldn't place it. She nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. She'd managed to shower and put on clean clothes, but she knew she still looked like someone who'd been hiding from the world. "Let's get him checked out," Dr. Wren said, leading them into an examination room that smelled like antiseptic and something faintly floral. "Tell me what happened." As Marjorie explained about the splinter, Dr. Wren listened with complete attention, occasionally asking gentle questions about Rook's eating habits, behavior, and how long he'd been with her. Her hands were gentle but thorough as she examined him, and Rook submitted to the process with remarkable patience. "He's in excellent health overall, Doctor," Wren concluded, cleaning the small wound on his paw. "This is healing nicely. You did exactly the right thing cleaning it. He's probably about 3 years old, neutered, and from his condition, I'd say he hasn't been on the streets very long. Someone took good care of him. Do you think, should I try to find his original owner?" Dr. Wren considered this carefully. "We can check for a microchip, and I'd recommend putting up some found cat flyers, but honestly, sometimes cats choose their people as much as people choose cats. The fact that he came to you during a storm and seems so settled, maybe he knows something you don't." As Dr. Wren prepared the microchip scanner, she glanced at Marjorie with what seemed like recognition. "You know, I think we've met before. Weren't you at Emma Patterson's birthday party about 2 years ago? The one at Magnolia Plantation?" Emma, her sister Emma, whom she hadn't spoken to in months. The memory hit her like a physical blow. That perfect spring day, the garden party under ancient oak trees, herself in a flowing dress, laughing at something someone had said, still confident in her place in the world. "Emma's my sister," she said quietly. Dr. Wren's expression softened. "She's mentioned you. She's worried about you, you know?" The microchip scanner beeped negative. No chip. Rook was officially a mystery, a creature without a documented past who had chosen her doorstep for his new beginning. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Wren handed her a business card along with the bill. "Clara," she said, "use my first name, and Marjorie, Emma talks about you more than you might think, just in case that matters." Walking home, Rook's carrier seemed lighter than it had on the way there. Or maybe she was stronger. The simple act of caring for him, of being responsible for another living creature's well-being, had awakened something in her that had been dormant for months. As she unlocked her front door, she realized she was already thinking about tomorrow's routine. Breakfast for Rook, opening the curtains, maybe even stepping onto the back porch to check on those loose boards. It was a start. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous-looking postal worker who seemed to hurry away from her front porch faster than usual. Marjorie opened it, while Rook performed his morning routine of sitting by various windows, waiting for her to let the light in. "Charleston Neighborhood Preservation Society," she read aloud, and Rook's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. "Regarding property maintenance concerns at 247 Rutledge Avenue," the letter was politely worded but firm. Her front garden had become inconsistent with neighborhood standards, and she had 30 days to address the landscaping concerns or face fines that would be placed as liens against her property. The back of her neck burned with shame as she read phrases like community standards and property values. She set the letter on the kitchen counter and looked out at the garden through newly clean windows. What had once been her pride and joy now looked like a testament to abandonment. The boxwood hedges were overgrown and shapeless. The grass was patchy and brown, and the flower beds were choked with weeds. Even the wrought iron fence needed painting, its black surface dulled by months of neglect. "Well," she said to Rook, who had moved to sit beside her, "I guess we're going outside." The garden center on Savannah Highway was overwhelming in its abundance. Rows of healthy plants basked in the October sunshine, their leaves still green despite the approaching winter. Marjorie pushed her cart slowly through the aisles, Rook having elected to stay home and supervise from the living room window. She'd done this before, of course. For 15 years, she'd maintained one of the most admired gardens in her neighborhood, spending weekend mornings deadheading roses and planning seasonal displays. But that felt like a different life, inhabited by a different person who had confidence and energy, and the belief that tending growing things was worth the effort. Now, standing among the healthy plants with their neat labels and promise of future beauty, she felt like an imposter. What right did someone who couldn't even tend herself have to nurture other living things? "Can I help you find something?" The voice belonged to a young man with dirt under his fingernails and the kind of deep tan that came from working outdoors. His name tag read Miguel, and he was looking at her with patient kindness. "I need everything," she admitted, gesturing helplessly at her empty cart. "My garden is—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't reveal too much. "It needs work." Miguel nodded as if this were the most normal request in the world. New to gardening or getting back into it? Getting back into it, after a break. "The best thing about plants," Miguel said, leading her toward a display of autumn flowers, "is they're very forgiving. Most of them want to grow, want to be beautiful. They just need someone to give them a chance." He helped her select mums in deep burgundy and gold, ornamental cabbages in purple and cream, and small shrubs that would provide structure through the winter. As they loaded her cart, he offered practical advice about spacing and watering, winter care and spring planning. His enthusiasm was infectious, and she found herself asking questions she hadn't thought she still cared about. "The secret," he said as she prepared to check out, "is to start small. Don't try to fix everything at once. Pick one area, make it beautiful, then move to the next. Gardens are built one small success at a time." Driving home with a car full of plants, Marjorie felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. Not the anxious dread that had colored every future moment, but genuine curiosity about how things might look different tomorrow. Rook greeted her return with obvious interest, following her back and forth as she unloaded the plants onto the front porch. When she finally opened the front door to begin carrying them inside for the night, he darted past her and settled himself in the middle of the porch, clearly intending to supervise. "You're going to be in the way," she warned him, but his presence made the task feel less daunting. The next morning she began with the front beds flanking her porch steps. The work was harder than she remembered. Her hands had gone soft during her months of isolation, and the October sun was warmer than expected. But there was something deeply satisfying about pulling weeds, feeling the soil between her fingers, creating small spaces where beautiful things could grow. Rook appointed himself project manager, alternately napping in sunny patches and investigating every new hole she dug. He seemed particularly fascinated by earthworms, crouching low to watch them writhe back into the disturbed soil. His presence turned the solitary work into something that felt almost social. By noon, she'd cleared and replanted one complete bed. The burgundy mums glowed like jewels against the white porch rails, and the ornamental cabbages added unexpected texture and color. It was a small victory, but it was undeniably an improvement. She was carrying her tools back to the shed when she heard the voice. "Marjorie, is that really you?" Mrs. Chen from next door was standing at the fence that separated their properties, holding a small watering can and looking genuinely delighted. Marjorie's first instinct was to flee, to mumble an excuse and escape into her house before the conversation could become uncomfortable. But Rook chose that moment to appear at her feet, winding around her ankles in a way that made sudden movement impossible. "Mrs. Chen," she said, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. "Hello. Your garden is looking better already. Those mums are beautiful." Mrs. Chen's smile was warm and uncomplicated. "And who is this handsome fellow?" "This is Rook. Here found me a few weeks ago." Rook, as if understanding he was being introduced, sat down and began grooming his white chest fur with elaborate nonchalance. The display made Mrs. Chen laugh. "He's quite the gentleman. You know, I've been wanting to thank you. I've noticed someone's been feeding the stray cats in the neighborhood. The grey tabby that used to dig through my garbage hasn't been around lately." Marjorie looked down at Rook, who paused his grooming to look back at her with unmistakable smugness. Had he been making rounds in the neighborhood before settling on her house? The thought that he might have chosen her specifically, out of all the available options, sent a warm flutter through her chest. "I think," she said slowly, "Rook might know more about the neighborhood cats than either of us." Over the following days, the garden work continued. Each morning, Rook would position himself somewhere in the yard and begin his patient supervision. His presence drew attention from other neighbors who were walking their dogs or collecting mail. Simple conversations began to happen, compliments on her progress, questions about her plants, recommendations for local landscapers or garden centers. Mrs. Patterson from across the street stopped to admire the ornamental cabbages and mentioned that she'd been wanting to redesign her own front beds. Mr. Sullivan from 2 houses down asked what type of mums she'd planted, because his wife loved that particular shade of burgundy. These weren't deep conversations, but they were connections. Thin threads tying her back into the fabric of community life she'd severed months ago. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon while she was working in the side yard, clearing an area that had become completely overgrown with English ivy. Rook had claimed a sunny spot nearby and was dozing contentedly when she heard footsteps on the sidewalk. "Excuse me?" Marjorie looked up to see a woman about her own age, with graying brown hair and kind eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was carrying a small bouquet of flowers and looked hesitant but determined. "I'm Sarah Jenkins. I live in the blue house on the corner. I've been watching you work on your garden, and I wanted to tell you how lovely it's looking." "Thank you," Marjorie said, suddenly aware of the dirt under her nails and the sweat dampening her shirt. "I also wanted to ask, would you be interested in helping with the neighborhood fall festival? We're planning it for next weekend, and we could really use someone with your gardening skills to help with decorations." The request hit her like a physical blow. The fall festival. She remembered it from before her world collapsed, remembered helping to organize it, remembered being the kind of person other people asked for help. The automatic refusal rose in her throat. She wasn't ready. She couldn't handle social situations. She had nothing to contribute. But then Rook stood up from his napping spot and walked over to Sarah, allowing her to scratch behind his ears while purring loudly enough for both women to hear. Marjorie began, then stopped. Looking at Rook's easy acceptance of this stranger, at Sarah's genuine smile, at her own hands dirty from working in soil that was producing something beautiful again, she felt the familiar crack in her carefully constructed walls widen just a little more. "I could help with the decorations," she heard herself say. I'm not very social anymore, but I could contribute plants, maybe help arrange displays." Sarah's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That would be wonderful. We're meeting Saturday morning at the community centre to plan everything. 10 o'clock if you can make it. After Sarah left, Marjorie sat in the dirt beside her flower bed, looking down at Rook, who had returned to his sunny spot and resumed his nap as if nothing momentous had just occurred. "What are you doing to me?" she asked him. 6 weeks ago I couldn't leave the house. Now I'm volunteering for community events." Rook opened one amber eye, regarded her with what seemed like satisfaction, then closed it again. His message was clear. This was exactly what was supposed to happen. That evening, as she showered off the day's dirt and looked at her hands, stained with soil but strong from honest work, Marjorie felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt useful. For the first time in months, she'd spent a day making something better instead of just trying to survive it. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd start on the back garden, and maybe, just maybe, she'd actually show up to that community meeting. Saturday morning arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed designed to keep people indoors with coffee and good intentions they'd never act upon. Marjorie stood at her bedroom window, watching the community centre parking lot across the street fill with cars, each arrival marking another person who'd committed to showing up while she wavered in her pajamas. Rook appeared at her feet, looking pointedly toward the closet where she kept her few decent public outfits. "I know," she told him. "I said I'd go, but look at this weather, and I don't even know these people anymore. What if they're just being polite? What if they don't really want my help?" Rook's response was to walk to the closet door and sit down, his meaning unmistakable. "You're very demanding for a stray cat," she muttered, but she was already reaching for clothes. The Charleston Community Centre was a converted firehouse with high ceilings and industrial-style windows that let in grey morning light. A dozen people sat in folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, coffee cups and notebooks balanced on their laps, voices mixing in the comfortable chaos of people planning something together. Marjorie paused in the doorway, that familiar panic rising in her chest. She could still leave. Make an excuse later, say she'd been sick, say her cat needed her, say anything except the truth, that she was terrified of being around people who might see through the careful facade she'd been rebuilding. "Marjorie!" Sarah Jenkins waved from across the room, her genuine smile cutting through the anxiety like sunlight. "I'm so glad you came. Everyone, this is Marjorie Hale, the one I told you about with the beautiful garden." The introductions blurred together. Tom and Linda from Hazel Street, Marcus, who ran the corner cafe, elderly Mrs. Pemberton, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years, young couples with toddlers and professionals with dogs and retirees with time to give back. Normal people living normal lives, treating her like she belonged among them. The festival planning was more complex than she'd expected. They needed decorations for 8 different stations, coordination with local vendors, a system for setup and cleanup, contingency plans for weather. As they talked through the logistics, Marjorie found herself making suggestions almost without realizing it, drawing on organizational skills she'd thought were lost along with everything else. "What if we used hay bales as bases for the flower displays?" she suggested. "They'd be heavy enough to stay stable in wind, and they'd add to the autumn theme." "That's brilliant," said Tom. "Where would we get hay bales?" "Miller's Farm on Highway 17 sells them, and they deliver." The information came automatically, from the part of her brain that had always stored practical details. "They'd probably give us a discount if we're ordering for a community event." By the time the meeting ended, she'd volunteered to coordinate all the floral decorations and had somehow agreed to help set up on Friday afternoon. Walking home, she felt the peculiar exhaustion that came from using social muscles that had atrophied during her months of isolation, but underneath the fatigue was something else: satisfaction. She'd contributed something valuable. She'd been useful. Rook was waiting in the front window when she returned, and she had the strangest feeling he'd been watching the community centre the entire time she was gone. "Well," she told him, as he wound around her ankles, "looks like we're throwing a party." The week that followed was a blur of phone calls and planning sessions and trips to various suppliers. Marjorie found herself talking to florists and farmers, coordinators and volunteers, her rusty social skills gradually remembering their rhythm. Each interaction was still an effort, but the effort was getting easier. Rook seemed to sense the increased activity in the house. He followed her as she made lists and organized supplies, occasionally batting at her pen when she paused too long in her writing. His presence had become so natural that she found herself explaining her decisions to him as if he were a business partner. "The mums need to be delivered Thursday," she told him. while checking items off her list. "And we'll need the hay bales Friday morning. Do you think 8 arrangements will be enough for the main tent?" Rook's response was to jump onto her paperwork and settle directly on top of her carefully organized notes, forcing her to take a break. "Point taken," she said, scratching behind his ears. "I'm getting a little obsessive, aren't I?" The festival was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, with setup beginning at noon. Friday morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect autumn weather that made the whole neighborhood seem to sparkle with possibility. Marjorie was loading her car with the first batch of decorating supplies when she heard barking from the direction of the park. 2 dogs were running loose, their leashes trailing behind them as they chased each other in wide circles. Their owner, a young woman with a jogging stroller, was calling frantically while trying to manage a crying toddler. The scene had all the hallmarks of impending disaster. Without thinking, Marjorie set down her box of supplies and walked toward the commotion. Years of living with pets had taught her that chasing loose dogs usually made them run farther, but calm authority often worked better. "Hey!" she called to the dogs in a firm but friendly voice, crouching down and extending her hand. "Come here, guys. Party's over." The smaller dog, a beagle mix with expressive brown eyes, trotted over immediately, apparently relieved to find a responsible adult. The larger one, a golden retriever, took more convincing, but eventually allowed himself to be caught. "Thank you so much," the young woman said breathlessly as Marjorie handed over the leashes. "I tripped and dropped them both, and they thought it was a game. I'm Jessica, by the way. We just moved to Rutledge Street last month." Marjorie: "And welcome to the neighborhood." As Jessica continued toward the park with her dogs and stroller, Marjorie realized something significant had just happened. She'd acted instinctively to help a stranger without calculating the social costs or worrying about whether she was qualified to intervene. For a few minutes, she'd simply been a neighbor helping another neighbor, the kind of person she used to be. The setup for the festival went smoothly, with volunteers working together in the easy rhythm of people who'd done this before. Marjorie's floral arrangements drew compliments from everyone who saw them, and she felt a pride she'd almost forgotten was possible. Her hands were dirty, her back was sore from lifting hay bales, and she was happier than she'd been in months. The festival itself exceeded everyone's expectations. Families wandered between booths selling local crafts and homemade goods. Children played games and painted pumpkins, and the autumn air filled with the scents of apple cider and kettle corn. Marjorie stationed herself at the information booth, helping visitors navigate the event and answering questions about the various vendors. It was while she was explaining the location of the restrooms to an elderly couple that she saw them, a family of 3 approaching with what looked like recognition in their eyes. The man was tall and lean. The woman had kind eyes behind stylish glasses, and their daughter appeared to be about 8 years old. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice careful and hopeful. "Are you the person who's been taking care of the grey cat? The one with white markings?" Marjorie's stomach dropped. "Why do you ask?" The woman stepped forward, pulling out her phone. "We think he might be our cat. We lost him about 2 months ago, right around the time we were moving. His name is Smokey, and he has a small scar on his left ear from when he was a kitten." She showed Marjorie a photo on her phone, a grey tabby with white markings sitting in a sunny window. The resemblance to Rook was unmistakable. Even more damning was the small white scar on the cat's left ear, exactly where Rook had a similar mark. "We've been looking everywhere," the little girl added, her voice thick with hope and tears. "He got scared during the move and ran away. We put up posters and called all the shelters, but we never found him." Marjorie felt the world tilt sideways. The cat who had saved her, who had coaxed her back into the light, who had become essential to her daily existence. He belonged to someone else. He had a real family who loved him and had been searching for him all along. Could we see him?" the woman asked gently. "Just to know for sure?" The walk home felt endless, even though it was only 3 blocks. The family, the Hendersons, she'd learned, followed at a respectful distance, their hope and anxiety almost tangible in the autumn air. With each step, Marjorie felt pieces of her carefully rebuilt life starting to crumble. Rook was napping in his favorite spot on the living room rug when they arrived. At the sound of the front door opening, he lifted his head with the lazy interest of someone expecting his dinner to be served soon. But when he saw the Henderson family, his entire demeanor changed. The little girl, Emma, like her sister, dropped to her knees. "Smokey!" Rook's ears perked forward. He stood, stretched, and then, in a movement that broke Marjorie's heart, ran directly to the child, purring loudly as she gathered him into her arms. "It's him," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's really him. Oh, Smokey, we missed you so much." The adult Hendersons were crying too, relief and joy radiating from them as they watched their daughter reunite with her beloved pet. Rook, Smokey submitted to their tearful attention with the patience of someone who remembered being loved this way. But then something unexpected happened. After several minutes of reunion, Rook gently extracted himself from the family's embraces and walked back to Marjorie. He sat at her feet and looked up at her with those amber eyes that had become so familiar, so essential. "He seems very attached to you," Mrs. Henderson observed. "You must have taken wonderful care of him." "He took care of me," Marjorie said quietly, the truth of it hitting her with fresh force. I wasn't doing very well when he found me. He kind of saved my life." The family exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Mr. Henderson crouched down to Rook's level. "What do you think, buddy? You seem happy here." Rook looked between Marjorie and the Henderson family, his expression almost thoughtful. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He walked to his food bowl, sat down, and looked meaningfully at both groups of humans. "I think," said little Emma with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from children, "he wants to have two families." The solution, when it came, was simpler than anyone had expected. The Hendersons lived only a few miles away, and they proposed a shared custody arrangement. Rook could spend weekdays with Marjorie and weekends with his original family, or whatever schedule worked best for everyone involved. The important thing was that he was safe and loved, and that no one had to lose him completely. "Are you sure?" Marjorie asked, hardly daring to believe this unexpected grace. "He was your cat first, but you're his person now too," Mrs. Henderson said with a smile. "Sometimes love means sharing, doesn't it?" Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. That evening, after the Hendersons had gone home with plans to return the next day to work out the details, Marjorie sat in her living room with Rook curled in her lap. The house felt different somehow. Not empty, but expanded, as if it had grown large enough to hold more love than she'd thought possible. "You planned this, didn't you?" she asked him, stroking his grey fur. "You knew they were looking for you, and you knew I needed you, so you figured out a way for everyone to win." Rook's purr was his only answer, but it seemed to vibrate with satisfaction. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood evening were settling in. Dogs barking, children being called in for dinner, the distant hum of traffic on King Street. Normal sounds from a normal world that she was, slowly but surely, learning to rejoin. The test had been whether she could love something enough to let it go. The miracle was discovering that sometimes, when you're willing to let go, love finds a way to let you keep holding on. The shared custody arrangement with the Hendersons settled into a rhythm more naturally than anyone had expected. Rook seemed to understand the schedule intuitively, positioning himself by the door on Sunday evenings when the Henderson family came to collect him, then appearing at Marjorie's front window each Wednesday morning like clockwork. His contentment with the arrangement was evident. He'd grown sleek and confident, a cat secure in being loved by multiple families. The November morning when everything changed started like any other. Marjorie was tending her newly expanded flower beds, preparing them for winter, when Rook emerged from his exploration of the backyard, carrying something in his mouth. He dropped it at her feet with obvious pride, a yellowed envelope slightly damp from being buried under fallen leaves. "What did you find?" she asked, picking up the envelope. Her name was written across the front in familiar handwriting, and her heart stopped. It was Emma's handwriting, her sister Emma, not the little Henderson girl. The postmark was from 8 months ago, which meant it had been delivered right around the time she'd stopped checking her mail regularly, when she'd been too deep in her shame spiral to face the outside world. Inside was a simple card, with a watercolor of Charleston's Rainbow Row on the front. The message inside was brief. "Marjorie, I know you're hurting, and I know you're proud, but I miss my sister. When you're ready to let me back in, I'll be here. I love you. Emma." Marjorie sank onto her garden bench, the card trembling in her hands. 8 months ago she would have crumpled it up, convinced it was pity or obligation disguised as love. But now, after months of learning to accept care from an unexpected source, after rediscovering what it meant to be needed and useful, she could read her sister's words for what they actually were, an invitation back to the family she'd convinced herself she'd lost forever. Rook jumped onto the bench beside her, pressing his warm body against her side, as if sensing the magnitude of the moment. "She was trying to reach me," Marjorie whispered. "All this time she was trying, and I was too scared to even look." That afternoon she did something she hadn't done in almost a year. She called her sister. "Emma, it's me." "Marjorie." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for panic to set in, but then Emma's voice came through, thick with emotion. "Oh, Margie, I was starting to think I'd never hear your voice again." The conversation that followed was halting at first, full of careful questions and tentative admissions. Emma had indeed been worried, had driven by the house multiple times, but never worked up the courage to knock. She'd sent the card during one of her most desperate moments, when she'd been afraid her sister was disappearing entirely. "I didn't think I deserved to have family anymore," Marjorie admitted, watching Rook groom himself in a patch of afternoon sunlight. "I made such a mess of everything, Em. I lost the practice, I lost my reputation, I lost myself. I convinced myself I was protecting you by staying away. You were protecting your pride," Emma said gently. "But I never needed protecting from you, Margie. I needed my sister back." They talked for 2 hours, filling in the gaps of 8 months of separation. Emma had started a new job at a non-profit downtown, was dating someone she thought Marjorie might actually like, had been going to therapy to work through her own patterns of family dysfunction. She'd maintained their mother's gravesite, had kept Marjorie's favorite coffee in her freezer just in case, had never stopped hoping for exactly this conversation. "Would you like to come over?" Marjorie found herself asking. "I could make dinner. It won't be anything fancy, but I'll be there in an hour," Emma said immediately. "Should I bring anything?" Marjorie looked around her living room, taking inventory. The curtains were open, letting in golden late-afternoon light. The floors were clean, the surfaces dusted. Fresh flowers from her garden sat in a vase on the coffee table. Rook's toys were scattered around, evidence of a life being actively lived rather than simply endured. "Just yourself," she said. "That's all I need." Emma arrived carrying a bottle of wine and a box of the expensive chocolates they'd shared as children during rare moments of sisterly peace. She was older, of course, they both were, but her smile was exactly the same, transforming her face into something luminous with joy. "The garden looks incredible," Emma said as Marjorie led her inside. "I drove by a few times and watching it come back to life. I kept hoping it meant you were coming back to life too." "I had help," Marjorie said, as if summoned by the words. Rook appeared from wherever he'd been napping. "Emma, meet Rook. Rook, this is my sister Emma." Emma crouched down to cat level, extending her fingers for inspection. Rook sniffed delicately, then allowed himself to be petted, purring his approval. "He's beautiful, and he has excellent timing. I saw him watching from the window when I pulled up, like he was announcing my arrival." Over dinner, simple pasta with vegetables from Marjorie's revived garden, the sisters began the delicate work of rebuilding their relationship. Emma shared stories from her new job working with homeless veterans, her struggles with dating after divorce, her own journey toward understanding that perfection wasn't a prerequisite for love. Marjorie found herself opening up about the months of isolation, the slow process of healing, the community she'd discovered through gardening and volunteering. "You know what's funny?" Emma said as they shared the expensive chocolates for dessert. "I kept driving by hoping to see signs that you were okay, and I saw the garden getting better, saw you outside working sometimes, but I convinced myself you didn't want to see me. We were both so afraid of rejection that we almost lost each other completely." "We're good at that," Marjorie admitted. "The Hale family specialty, pride disguised as self-protection." Rook chose that moment to jump onto the table, delicately sniffing the chocolate box, before settling himself between the two sisters like a furry mediator. "I think he's making a point," Emma laughed. "Something about staying present instead of running away." As the evening wound down, Emma helped with dishes while sharing neighborhood gossip and family updates. Their mother's best friend was finally moving to assisted living. Their cousin's daughter had gotten married. Life had continued moving forward during Marjorie's months of absence, but there was still a place for her in the ongoing story. "I should go," Emma finally said, though neither sister seemed eager to end the evening. "But Marjorie, could we do this again, maybe make it a regular thing?" "Yes," Marjorie said without hesitation. "I'd like that. I've missed you so much, Em." The hug they shared at the front door was the first physical affection Marjorie had experienced with another human being in almost a year. It lasted long enough to matter, long enough to begin healing wounds that had seemed permanent. After Emma left, Marjorie sat in her living room with Rook purring in her lap, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. In the space of 8 hours, she'd gone from believing she'd lost her family forever to planning weekly dinners with her sister. The change felt almost too significant to be real. "You orchestrated this too, didn't you?" she asked Rook, burying that card where I'd eventually find it, waiting until I was strong enough to handle the truth. Rook's purr intensified, and she chose to take that as confirmation. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of small miracles. Emma became a regular dinner guest, sometimes bringing her new boyfriend David, who turned out to be kind and funny and completely unintimidated by the Hale family dynamics. The Hendersons invited Marjorie to little Emma's birthday party, where Rook held court as guest of honor, and Marjorie found herself genuinely enjoying the company of people she was still getting to know. Dr. Clara Wren stopped by the house one afternoon to check on Rook's paw, which had healed perfectly, and stayed for coffee and conversation that had nothing to do with veterinary care. The community garden project that had emerged from the fall festival was approved by the city council, with Marjorie volunteering to coordinate the plant selection and layout design. Each connection felt tentative at first, like stepping on ice that might not hold her weight. But gradually, as days passed without catastrophic rejection or judgment, she began to trust that she might actually belong in the world again. The real test came in December, when Clara mentioned that the Charleston Bar Association was hosting a holiday fundraiser for legal aid services. "I know it might be complicated," Clara said carefully, "given your history with the legal community. But they're looking for volunteers to help with event planning, and honestly, you're the most organized person I know." The old Marjorie would have declined immediately, too mortified by her professional failures to face former colleagues. But the new Marjorie, or perhaps the recovered Marjorie, found herself considering the possibility. "What if people remember? Then they remember," Clara said simply. "But what if they also remember all the good work you did for 20 years? What if they're relieved to see you re-entering the community?" That evening, Marjorie discussed the invitation with Rook, who listened with the serious attention he brought to all important matters. "It would mean facing people who saw me fall apart," she told him. "People who might judge me, or pity me, or worst of all, pretend nothing happened." Rook's response was to walk to the window and look out at the neighborhood, now decorated with early holiday lights. His message seemed clear. The world was full of people living imperfect lives, making mistakes, trying again. She wasn't uniquely flawed or uniquely unworthy of second chances. The fundraiser was held at a historic mansion in the Garden District, the kind of elegant Charleston venue where Marjorie had once felt completely at home. Walking up the front steps in her best dress, cleaned and pressed for the first time in a year, she felt every bit the fraud she'd convinced herself she was. But then she saw familiar faces, people who'd known her before her fall, and their reactions weren't what she'd expected. There was genuine warmth, relief, even joy at seeing her again. Judge Morrison, who'd presided over some of her most challenging cases, made a point of finding her and expressing how much she'd been missed. Her former secretary, now working for another firm, hugged her tightly and said she'd been hoping for exactly this moment. "We knew you'd be back eventually," said Patricia Wells, a fellow attorney who'd always been more colleague than friend. "You're too good at what you do to stay away forever. And honestly, watching you rebuild has been inspiring. Not everyone has the courage to start over." By the end of the evening, Marjorie had volunteered to coordinate next year's event and had tentatively agreed to consider doing some pro bono work for the legal aid clinic. Walking home through her neighborhood, past houses glowing with warm light and holiday decorations, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. She felt proud of herself. Rook was waiting in the front window when she returned, silhouetted against the living room lamp like a guardian watching over her homecoming. As she unlocked the front door, she realized this was exactly what it was. A homecoming to a life she'd thought she'd lost forever. "We did it," she told him, as he wound around her ankles in greeting. "We actually did it. We came back." On Christmas morning, Emma arrived early with coffee and pastries, and they opened gifts by the fireplace while Rook supervised from his favorite chair. The Henderson family stopped by in the afternoon to exchange presents and share holiday cookies, little Emma delighting in showing Rook the new toys she'd chosen specifically for him. As evening approached, and the house filled with the golden light of winter sunset, Marjorie found herself standing in her living room, surrounded by evidence of a life rebuilt. Cards from neighbors on the mantel, plans for the community garden spread across the coffee table, Rook's toys scattered across the Persian rug, the lingering warmth of laughter and conversation. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman who believed she didn't deserve forgiveness, didn't merit second chances, didn't have anything left to offer the world. She'd been so wrong about all of it. Forgiveness hadn't arrived as a grand gesture or dramatic revelation. It had come in small daily choices. The decision to feed a hungry cat, to open curtains and let in light, to accept help and eventually offer it to others. It had come through the patient love of a creature who refused to let her disappear into her shame, who had somehow known that healing required connection, purpose, and the revolutionary act of caring for something beyond herself. Rook looked up at her from his chair, those amber eyes reflecting the lamplight, and she could swear she saw satisfaction there. His work was complete. The broken woman who had opened her door to him during a storm was gone, replaced by someone who understood that redemption was always possible, that love could be shared without being diminished, that even the most closed heart could learn to open again. Outside, the neighborhood settled into Christmas evening quiet, and inside, a woman who had learned to forgive herself sat with the cat who had shown her how, both of them surrounded by the warm glow of a life worth living. The lesson was clear and simple and profound. Sometimes salvation comes on 4 paws during a storm, and all we have to do is be brave enough to open the door.